When you run into an environment like Duet, and I say environment because it's a culture, an environment that when you are introduced to that type of environment, you start to feel alive again. And that's what hope is.
I was a perfect candidate for a lung transplant until the doctor told me after several CAT scans that the words you don't want to hear from a doctor ever was, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do for you."
Jen came to live with me in 2012. In August, actually, so. Yeah, she was coming for our vacation. At the time that she came to me, I was feeling a lot of different emotions. You know, one of them was relief because I knew that there was a lot of neglect and things that was going on. I'd been through, you know, secretively paying for electric bills and things for several years because that's my grandbaby.
Eventually, as my husband Ed's abilities kept diminishing, I thought, wow, I need more help with this. I need more help. But when it really became real for me was when I took Ed to a neurologist and the doctor said, Ed should not be alone.
Because of Ron, I look forward to today, knowing that if I need Ron, he's there, he's a phone call away. And let me say this, Ron Winterberg has his own life. He has his own life. He has a wife, a beautiful lady, Joyce, who's of ill health. And Ron has taken care of her. And he also took care of me. This is not a volunteer, this is an angel. He was sent from heaven, from Duet. God bless you, Ron. God bless Duet for teaming us up.
There was, I think, 3 different people that had affiliation with Duet that said, oh, you've got to go to Duet. Oh, you've got to try this. They have all of these you know, they're there for us. You're not alone. They kept saying that was the turning point.
I'm so happy, so thankful that the people in the Duet group helped me to get prepared for the reality I was facing. And I'm so grateful for all the support from my Duet family.
Good morning. My name is Ann Wheat, and I'm proud to serve as Executive Director for Duet, Partners in Health and Aging. Thank you for joining us today for Duet's Family Caregiver Symposium. For quite some time now, we've been looking forward to this opportunity to bring 2 luminaries in the world of family caregiving, Dr. Arthur Kleinman and Dr. Pauline Boss, together, believing their messages would resonate with those who provide care and the professionals who support them. With attendees joining us from 18 states and 3 countries, it appears you agree. I want to give a very special thank you to our gold sponsor, AARP Phoenix, and our copper sponsors, Dignity Health, Hospice of the Valley, and KJZZ. We truly appreciate their support in bringing this high-quality program to our community. 2021 marks Duet's 40th year providing free-of-charge services for homebound adults, grandparents raising grandchildren, faith community nurses and the wellness programs they provide, and of course, supporting family caregivers throughout their caregiving journeys with support groups, personalized guidance, workshops, and events such as this. We are passionate about what we do. I hope you had the opportunity to see the video trailer introducing Duet's Finding Meaning and Hope workshops for family caregivers based on Dr. Boss's book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. If you feel like you could use a community of support through any of our services, or want to learn more about becoming a Finding Meaning and Hope participant or a facilitator, please reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. Now, I am so pleased to introduce today's moderator, Kathy Ritchie. Kathy began her public radio career in 2014 when she joined KJAZ. She regularly covers breaking news as well as issues affecting people with disabilities and older Americans. Kathy also contributes stories to NPR and WBUR's Here and Now. She also chronicled her experience as a family caregiver in a blog called My Demented Mom. Before coming home to Arizona in 2009, Kathy lived in New York City. She got her start at ABC News and Fox News after earning her master's degree from New York University. Kathy earned her undergraduate degree from Arizona State University. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Kathy Ritchie.
Big thank you to all of you watching this event on your computer. I'm delighted to see so many caregivers joining us virtually from across the country and abroad. We know this year has been incredibly challenging, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor all of you and your hard work. You are the advocates, and without you, your loved ones might not have a voice. And so when the days are difficult, and I know they can be, I encourage you to take a moment and remember that you matter, that you are not alone. And we see you. I see you, especially now during these trying times when it can be difficult to carve out a moment to simply take a breath. I have a few housekeeping announcements, few housekeeping notes. So if you have questions for our speakers, please place them in the Q&A box. It's on the lower part of your screen, at the bottom of your screen, so Duet staff can compile them. And you can do this at any time throughout the program. For any other questions, use the same Q&A box. So after hearing from both Dr. Kleinman and Dr. Boss, we will start our Q&A session. But before we get started, I wanted to briefly share my story with you. Some of you know me from my work at KJZZ, where I do cover a lot of aging issues in the Valley. How I got there is another story. Like you, I was a family caregiver. My mother, Margarita Ritchie, had frontotemporal degeneration. It's a very challenging dementia, primarily because of the behaviors that are sometimes associated with FTD. I was in my late 20s when I first noticed something wasn't right. From there, it was 10 years of ups and downs, mostly downs. I wrote about this time in a blog, and for me, it was really a form of therapy and a way to process what was happening because almost everything that was going on was not normal. Being evicted from 3 assisted living facilities was not normal. Visiting my mother at a geriatric psych unit was not normal. My mother pushing me over to get to the front of the communion line at church was not normal. My mom calling me over and over and over again while I was at work was not normal. But that was our life. My mom died 7 years ago. Since then, I have struggled to reconcile those last years of her life because she suffered. And that sticks with me. It's hard to remember what she was like before FTD. I still look back with regret and occasionally suffer from wishful thinking, especially because I know so much more today about the caregiving journey than I did then. So where am I with all of this? Well, to answer that, I have to tell you about a gentleman, and he is a gentleman named Don Cook. I met him through Ann Wheat, and he appeared in a story I produced about male caregivers in 2017, and later in a podcast I made about life after dementia called The Recovering Caregiver. In that podcast, Don said, I cannot unsee what I have seen. I cannot unlearn what I have learned. In Don's case, he went on to support other caregivers on their journey, serving as a guide, really. For Don's journey didn't abruptly stop when his wife passed away. His journey was just different. And if you have the chance to talk to Don, please do. He's so wise and just so thoughtful. And that's where I am. The journey continues. Like Don, I cannot unsee what I have seen, and I cannot unlearn what I have learned. And for me, that means talking about the myriad issues affecting older Arizonans and their caregivers. So even though I am not a caregiver today, my caregiving journey didn't end the day she died. I'm still on the path. Like Don, it's just different. On that note, I want to say thank you. Caregivers are part of a special club, even when our loved one is gone. And while you may not know me, you understand me. So thank you for being a part of my support system. With that, it is my honor to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Arthur Kleinman. Dr. Kleinman is the author of The Soul of Care, The Moral Education of a Husband and a Doctor. He's one of the most renowned and influential scholars and writers on psychiatry, anthropology, global health, and cultural and humanistic issues in medicine. Educated at Stanford University and Stanford Medical School, he has taught at Harvard for over 40 years. He's currently a professor of psychiatry and of medical anthropology at Harvard Medical School and the Esther and Sidney Rabb Professor of Anthropology in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Very much looking forward to the unfolding of this event. I'm here as a fellow traveler, as it were. I've spent more than 50 years studying care of one sort or another. But for 10 years, I was one of the currently 50 million family caregivers and cared for my late wife, Joan, who died of early onset Alzheimer's disease. Can I have the first slide? And just go right by that to the next one, please. Great. As a result of that 10 years, I wrote a book that came out in 2019 called The Soul of Care. It was not my first book, it was my 7th book. But actually, everything I really felt that was essential, core to care, I learned best in caring for Joan. Next slide. In order to understand any kind of care, you have to begin with relationships. And this is a relationship between a young medical student and a young teacher of French and Chinese. This was 1965 in Palo Alto, California, on our marriage day. It was said at the time that, for those of you my age, that Audrey Hepburn was a look-alike with Joan. Next slide. Next slide, thanks. And this was the two of us when I was a resident in psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and Joan was doing her Chinese literature and Chinese painting. Next slide. And this is Joan in midlife on the Oregon coast. Next slide. This is us, the two of us together in midlife. Next slide. And this is Joan just before the onset, her early onset of Alzheimer's in her late 50s. Next slide. And this is Joan just in the early stage of her Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. Thank you. And this is the two of us in our garden early in the early stage of Alzheimer's. Next slide. This was Joan well along in her decade-long decline with this unfortunate dementia. And next slide. And this is Joan on her deathbed, hours before she died, in a excellent nursing home in Massachusetts, where she spent the last few months of her life when I could no longer care for her at home. And to show you the closeness of our relationship, in the last few weeks of her life, she only had one word, and that was my first name, Arthur. Next slide. And this is her gravestone in the Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is a magnificent cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we've lived so much of our lives. And my adult children and I tried to find words to express in a very succinct fashion what we thought of Joan. And you'll see those words are beauty, wisdom, goodness, above all love, there's Jones dates and there's plenty of room for my name to go on this stone when the time comes. Next slide. So I want to talk about caregiving as I presented in my book, The Soul of Care. And for those of you who really want to follow up on these ideas, please read The Soul of Care, which is now in a Penguin paperback. Caregiving is inseparable from relationships. The quality of the relationship will determine much of the quality of caregiving. And caregiving in relationships is a kind of reciprocity. All of you who are married know this. The give and take over a lifetime of one caring for another, stepping up at a certain time into the active role, retiring into a more passive role. In the era of COVID and our current COVID times, I think we're very attentive to this reciprocal nature of care. And it's extremely important to keep this in mind, because the recipient of care, the person who, medically speaking, is the patient, or the person with dementia, or with other serious illnesses, or with end of life, or with serious disability in a child, that person is crucial to the care. That person gives the gift of their need for help, assistance, protection, and in return gets the gift of active involvement of the family carer. Sometimes in the course of care, for all of us, real problems occur. Always there's a sense that we're not meeting the responsibilities fully that we'd like to. At times, we feel overwhelmed. Some people run away as a result of this. Others, at some point, have to drop out. Caregiving is one of the most difficult but important things that human beings do with one another. It is a defining aspect of our humanity, and it is the social glue that holds every society together. The second part of caregiving I want to talk about is presence, our human presence with others. The third part is ritual and habits. Fourth part is enduring. How do we endure? I'm a stickler for the use of this word because I felt in the course of my caregiving that the term resilience was a euphemistic nonsense. It was a romantic idea that we're rubber bands that spring back. None of us are resilient in the full meaning of that word. We all barely endure. But in the course of enduring, we can have joy, we can have some degree of hope, and we can also have purpose, the most important of those things I just mentioned. I want to speak about care as a human developmental process. Since women are socialized in most societies, including ours, more toward care and men less so. In fact, you could almost say in America that boys are socialized to wanton carelessness. And that was my experience of growing up. I particularly want to focus on barriers to care because we're in a crisis of care, especially in long-term care. And then I want to talk about the fact that care does not end with a person who dies. Caring goes on for family members, and I'll tell you the truth, for professionals as well, in the carrying of memories of the patients we've cared for. Next slide.
Sorry, Dr. Kleinman, that is the last slide.
That's the last slide. Okay. Sorry about that. I thought there were several others. Let me leave that last slide up. Leave that last slide up. And can you return that last slide, please? Yeah. And let me just take you through each one. of the ones that I mentioned. Let's start with presence, since we did relationships. Presence is about the being there. I just heard on NPR today, a young doc in one of the hospitals in Los Angeles, caring for COVID patients in the middle of a real crisis of care in Los Angeles, where their intensive care units are simply overrun, and they can't give the kind of care they want to each patient. They can barely stay on top of patients. And he talked about the difficulty and yet the sacredness, those were his words, of being there at the end, in intubating a patient, with a patient who's dying, trying to be there for them since the families couldn't be there. That's presence. That's being with. That's what all of us who've been caregivers know we aim for, we want to be. But often caregiving becomes mechanical. In the profession, it happens too often, in the health professions. But in families as well, we become mechanical because we are so overwhelmed, we're so tired, there's so much to do. It's easier to just go in and go out. But it is our presence that really is called forth. And it's called forth not magically and not in some unknown way. It's called forth by the love we have for that other person, by the respect, by the desire to honor them, by the need to help them, by their needs. Caregiving is about rituals and habits. I have an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that some of you may want to read about how rituals and habits I learned in caring for my wife helped me in COVID, in social isolation. Because organizing the day along the lines of ritual and developing good habits lets that day flow more easily. I mentioned enduring, and so I won't spend much more time on that other than to say that I've spoken to many families who've dealt with serious, very serious health problems that have ended eventually in death. And what is characteristic of their responses and my own experience is the sense that at some point, caregiving feels like one is up against a wall. Sometimes you can get over that wall. Often you don't feel you can get over it. In the book, The Soul of Care, I talk about examples where I felt I could not get over the wall that I was against. Early in Alzheimer's, my wife, Joan, said, "Come on, Arthur, you can do it." And I got over that wall. Later on, when she couldn't respond like that, it was the sense that I needed to do it for her, that it had to happen. Feelings I'm sure every one of you has had that gets us over the wall. But sometimes we recognize that we can't get over this wall alone. We need real assistance. And this is so crucial to care. We need someone who can give us respite time. If we have long-term care insurance or we have the funds, we can hire a home health aide. A single home health aide for me, who developed a great relationship with Joan that I described in the book, made all the difference, made it possible for me to work during the week, 9 to 5, and take care of Joan from 5 to 9 during the week and both weekend days. That kind of assistance, we often are hesitant about getting, feeling that if we get it, we're emphasizing that we failed in some way. Nothing could be further than the truth. The earlier you get assistance, the better. But the astonishing thing is that the medical profession, especially the field of neurology, often forgets to tell us the importance of having help. Help from other family members, help from friends, to give us respite care, help if we can afford it from a home health aide. I mentioned the human developmental process, boys and girls being different in the way they deal with care. I was raised in a well-to-do New York family and was raised in a wanted to be wantonly careless. I never made my bed when I was little, didn't pick up things around the room, paid almost no attention to the care of others. In fact, I went in the opposite direction. Growing up in Brooklyn in the 1940s, I became a tough, rough kid. And one day when I was 12 years old, a mafia recruiter mussed my hair and said to me, "Kid, you're doing great. Keep it up. We got our eyes on you." And I passed it on to my folks, and they realized we had to get out of where we were living, and we moved somewhere else where I changed, became more academically inclined, but I didn't really learn to care until the first 36 years of my 46-year marriage, when Joan was the primary caregiver for myself and our two kids. And she taught me how to be a caregiver so that when she needed care, 36 years into our marriage, I could do it. And I could do it because I was learning from her all those elements of care, from social support to practical acts, to emotional support, to the spirituality of care, that are central to be able to have a purposeful relationship with the person you're caring for. Now, there are all kinds of barriers to this. The biggest barrier of all, of course, is resources. If you're economically limited in what you can pay for in our society regrettably does not have the kind of healthcare system that supports much of what I talked about. If we are living today in Germany, Holland, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan, we would have healthcare systems that provide us with home health aides if we need them. In the United States, very few of us have long-term care insurance because the insurance companies don't want to pay for that. The chaotic healthcare system every one of us has experienced requires a negotiator, someone who can take us across and navigate that system. Finding the right social worker or other person to do that is absolutely crucial. And when we engage the professional healthcare system, we engage it at the worst possible moment, because our professional healthcare system has declining interest, attention, and investment in quality care. Whenever you hear, and I'm telling you this as a researcher now, whenever you hear a hospital or a clinic tell you, inform you that they have high quality care, what they're telling you is that they measure the institutional efficiency of moving X number of patients at Y rate with U outcome, and it's a measure of efficiency. They're not telling you about the quality of relationships, whether doctors listen to you, whether they respond to your needs, the good advice or absent advice you get. None of that is measured. And that is what we would have to measure quality. And our broken healthcare system has declining quality in part because technology, which should help us, and I believe eventually will help us, gets in the way, so that the electronic health record becomes a frustrating experience for every doctor. And you go into an interview today and maybe the doctor's back is turned to you, which is the worst thing you could possibly experience, since the relationship has to be a human interaction, face to face, but that doctor is struggling to make sense of what is on the screen in front of them. And then there is the caring for memories. I mentioned earlier, and this is the last point I really want to make, that care does not end with death. It goes on. It is in the memories inside of us. I can return like that if I want to the kernel of memory that is almost like a tape running inside of me. And I can open up those little kernels on each event that sticks with me and go in detail, almost as if I'm reliving it again. The way we order our memories, the way we distance some that are more difficult to deal with and bring others closer as we recognize that they are helpful in supporting us. That's critical to the way we live our lives from the point of bereavement. And bereavement is so much, grieving is so much about how we deal with memories to later on, years, decades afterward. Well, the gist of all this is a set of recommendations about how to care, how to keep going, what keeps us going. And they're all in the book, The Soul of Care. I hope many of you will get a chance to read that book and follow up with other things that I have written. I want to wish you all the best in a difficult time and in the difficult but important work of caregiving, and end with one important, crucial finding, I believe, about care. We all know that measurements of the burden of care show the economic, psychological, and social cost of care to all of us and our families. But studies have also shown that if you measure, especially in care of the elderly, if you ask about family responses to that care while they're doing it and after families have lost someone, we report an incredible amount of meaning and purpose that comes out of that event. And there is evidence, early evidence, that actually those people who do care and find that meaning may live longer. So that although we recognize all the burdens and troubles and difficulties of care, there are important, crucial, core dimensions of care that keep us human and alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kleinman. Thank you so much for that. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Pauline Boss. She is a professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota, a fellow in the American Psychological Association and American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, a former president of the National Council on Family Relations, and a family therapist in private practice. With her groundbreaking work as a scientist practitioner, Dr. Boss is the principal theorist in the study of ambiguous loss, a term she coined in the 1970s. Since then, she has researched various types of ambiguous loss, summarizing her work in the widely acclaimed book, Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief. Dr. Boss will be drawing from her latest book, The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in a Time of Pandemic, which will be published in later this year in November, to share with us the insights on caregiving in the midst of pandemic uncertainty. So with that, welcome, Dr. Boss.
Welcome, everyone. I only wish I could see you in person. I understand we have a global audience, and it's just an honor to be speaking for Duet again, which is a very, very wonderful organization for caregivers. And I'm glad that is now going global. Thank you to Duet for inviting me back. The title of my presentation is Caregiving in the Midst of Pandemic Uncertainty. And indeed, we're still in the midst of it, although we have added vaccinations to it now. When I agreed to do this presentation, I need to tell you that I was a caregiver for my husband. Slide number 2. We've been together for 38 years, and he's 88 years old. And I was taking care of him with the help of in-home caregivers, by the way, who helped out immensely. I got pretty good at wound care. He could not walk. He had some vascular issues, of course. and taking blood for the INR bi-weekly tests. So I was a reluctant caregiver, became a caregiver for this dear man. But I need to tell you now, he passed in September. And so now I'm in transition. Next slide, please. I've made slides only of the topics I'm going to cover. During the pandemic, we've had so many losses, and as caregivers, you've already had so many losses, gradual losses that come over the years. First, when someone cannot travel anymore, and then they can't talk with you anymore, then later on, they may not be able to swallow, and so on. So there's a step down progression of caregiving, which, by the way, they also call people who take care of children caregivers, but with caregiving children, it's a step up progress. And you're stepping up to when they don't need you anymore. And it's a joyful thing. With caregiving that we do, the journey is downward, sadly. And so there is the stress of grieving along the way as well. So when we're talking about what the pandemic did to us, it added the load of uncertainty to what you already have. So we should take a look at some losses that you have. I'm first going to talk about some clear losses, just briefly. Loss of savings, loss of retirement income, loss of job, loss of home. If you didn't experience this, your neighbor may have, because we are a nation in grief and in trouble right now because of the disparities among people who have lost so much. There has also been death. And you may wonder what I think about death. At first, I used to say there's clear loss and there's ambiguous loss. And death is a clear loss because you have a death certificate. I no longer believe that. I think there's ambiguity surrounding death as well. As Kathy Ritchie mentioned, you have unanswered questions that follow you. And you may have questions surrounding the death. Did they know, in fact, I love them, and so on. But let's put the pandemic on top of that. What you have now is the loss of a person who needs you by their bedside when they're ill. You have the loss of a person who is dying, and you can't be there unless the nurse holds up a telephone so that you can be psychologically present. And so that's a major loss right now, the loss of being with loved ones who are hospitalized or dying, the loss of rituals after such a death, the loss of being able to visit a loved one who is alive but living in another place, the loss of birthday and holiday rituals together, as we always do, and we gain strength from that. And the big one, the loss of touching, hugs, others. Some of us haven't been touched for a year. In my case, I'm very fortunate because a granddaughter happens to be in my pod, and so I get regular hugs from her. There's also the loss of feeling secure about your own health and the health of your loved one, and the loss of wondering if you should have outside help come into your home for caregiving because of the safety issue now with COVID. I just want to say to you, to all of you who are grieving someone or something you loved and lost during this pandemic, may I say this? What you have lost is not the chance for closure, but more likely the chance to say goodbye, to be with your loved one as they lay dying, to finish the unfinished business, to ask for forgiveness, to give forgiveness, to say I love you, and to touch your loved one's hand for the last time. It's not closure we need, but certainty that they understood why we couldn't be there to comfort them that day. Without these things, some doubts may linger for you, but that is the nature of loss. the ending is always ambiguous, whether it's death or whether it's dementia. So what is ambiguous loss? Ambiguous loss is a loss that's not clear. That is, and therefore there's no possibility of resolution. There are two different kinds, physical and psychological. Physical ambiguous loss is when a person is physically missing but kept psychologically present, as there is no proof of life or death. By the way, we are that for each other today. We are psychologically present for each other, but physically missing, and we're on Zoom. So that's a more common version of it now during the pandemic. We're all ambiguously lost to one another today, but hopefully we're psychologically present and we can enjoy each other's company that way. So my early research was done with families of pilots shot down in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. The soldiers were missing in action. But it's also true when sailors have vanished at sea, at kidnappings and so on. But more common physical ambiguous losses would be breakups, separations, divorce, adoption. And those are very, very common. Also foster care, I would add. It also applies to us if our loved one is moved to a facility and no longer at home. That means we're present, but we're also absent with each other. And that's a very tough time for most people, most caregivers. The second kind of ambiguous loss is psychological. So you're psychologically gone, but physically with the person. You know this all too well. The person you are taking care of is physically there, perhaps right in front of you or beside you, but they are psychologically gone due to dementia or traumatic brain injury or some serious mental illness or addiction. The more common version of this is when your partner is preoccupied with the telephone, for example, or some other device where they even sit at the dinner table while their mind is someplace else. Then we have grief. The effects of ambiguous loss have been amplified due to the pandemic. And therefore, there is more anxiety than usual, more grief than usual, more anger than usual, which you can see in the newspapers, more loneliness than usual, and perhaps more depression, but it also might just be sadness, which would be normal in this abnormal situation. So I can't go into everything in depth here, but I want to say something about what's normal grieving. Freud said something about that early in his life in Mourning and Melancholia, but then it sort of disappeared and grief became an illness. Caregivers know that grief goes on sometimes for decades. You grieve along the way. You see this person you loved and you married fade away from what they were. So you have a sadness that's with you all the time. I think that's normal, but it's very difficult to bear. I don't think the general public knows this, by the way, that we grieve along the way. The general public is aware about still the 5 stages of grief that Kubler-Ross espoused. And you need to know that she denied those on her deathbed and before. Her last 2 books are the most interesting of her books, but in fact, few people read them because they're pretty much stuck on her earlier work. What did she say in her last days? She said that she regretted the 5 stages, that it wasn't in 5 stages. Our society places an enormous pressure on us to get over loss, to get over the grief. That's true. We need to get over it, at least in this Western culture. Up to her last days, Kubler-Ross continued to correct the misuse of her 5 stages. Quote, "They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. The 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with one we lost, but they are not stops on some linear timeline grief. And in the end, she said, I now know that the purpose of my life is more than these stages. It's not just about knowing the stages. It's not just about the life lost, but also the life lived. We should remember Kubler-Ross and honor her for what she gave us, and that was the hospice movement. And we should read her last books to update ourselves on whether or not we can get over grief if we do the 5 stages. That's nonsense. Okay, next slide, please. Well, Dr. Kleinman, I'm going to talk about something that you don't like, but we can agree to disagree on this one. With a situation that you can't fix, an ambiguous loss, such as dementia, the pandemic, at least at the beginning, now we're beginning to have vaccines. Resilience becomes the only way to keep yourself going during adversity. And I define resilience more narrowly just for my work, and that is resilience is the tolerance for ambiguity. And in our culture, we're not very good at that. We like to master things. We like clarity. We like certainty. We like binary thinking. There is an answer. There's a right and a wrong answer. Well, there isn't with caregiving, is there? Caregiving is full of ambiguity. It's full of unanswered questions. Today, you never know if you've completed whatever it was you had hoped to complete, and you never know if it's going to help. And in fact, it tends not to, because the trajectory is downward. I want to say something, though, that there's a caution about resilience. Resilience is a term that was developed some years ago by someone who was studying children in poverty in Hawaii. They lived on the street, they were homeless and so on. And he came up with the concept of competence, and eventually it turned into resilience. The caution is this: we need to get rid of poverty, and we need to get rid of dementia. We need to find preventions. We need to find cures. We need to get rid of things that require resilience. So resilience is the backup measure for problems that have no solution. Okay, and here's how I define resilience. Resilience is a flexibility as opposed to a rigidity, which makes you more fragile. So resilience would mean flexibility, and when you get knocked down, you can get up again eventually. Yes, you do get knocked down. You really do. There are days when you just can't do it anymore. But you get up again, and that's resilience. It's like a sapling tree in a windstorm. It bends over, it touches the ground, but when the storm is over, if it's flexible enough and not brittle, the tree stands up straight again. That's how I see resilience. The benefits of not seeking closure. Closure is a false idea. Closure is a wonderful idea in real estate or when you're signing a business contract, but it does not work in human relationships, not even after death. The relationship continues, but albeit in a different way, and much more symbolic. But you have memories and you don't forget. And so be aware that in this new book I'm writing, The Myth of Closure, I'm saying that it's a misnomer. What people want after a death is they want some certainty about where the body is. They want some certainty that they were able to say goodbye. They want some certainty that of life versus death. A death certificate gives you certainty. If it was a murder, for example, a trial may give you justice, but closure is the wrong word to use in human relationships. Now I want to talk briefly about the guideposts. In the book, I call them guidelines, but because of today's time limit, I'm calling them guideposts. They really are from psychology and sociology, terms that are very familiar. Meaning, mastery, that's from sociology. Identity, ambivalence, that's from both sociology and psychology. Attachment and new hope. I present these as ways for us to find meaning and hope in our caregiving. So they are not linear, they are in a circle, and you can pick whichever one appeals to you at the time. And I have been using it periodically through the caregiving journey, but now I have to do it all over again because of my new identity as a widow. The first time I checked that box, it was really shocking to me. And so I have to come up. Right now, identity is sort of front and center for me, but you need to pick what is for you. Let me go through them more or less personally, if you don't mind, because it will give you an example of what you can do as your situation changes. You may be caregiving now, but down the line, you may also not have someone to care for, and then you need to do this again. The meaning of my husband's death is clearly he's out of pain. He had many different physical maladies, rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, et cetera, great pain. And the meaning now is that he's out of pain. Mastery, for example, that's a big one for me. My father was an immigrant from Switzerland. My mother's parents were from Switzerland. And I was raised in a Swiss American community in southern Wisconsin, where everything was precision, precision, work hard, and you will get to heaven. So mastery was drilled into me. And I still like to know that one can master a situation. Our country is one of mastery. We've put a man on the moon and a rover on Mars. And we're going back again into outer space, and we do many, many things. And by the way, we've come up with a vaccine faster than ever before. Wonderful. That's mastery of science in this case. But what do you do when you can't master a situation like dementia or like death? I found that I felt better if I would write a little bit each day. And what I learned was I could shape that sentence or that paragraph any way I wanted, and it felt good. It felt like mastery. And the rest of my day was not. It was just adapting. I talked to you about identity. I'm gradually getting to the point of seeing myself as a widow. I have to, all this paperwork. And by the way, after the death of a person, the paperwork is astounding. And there was a great deal of anger about that in me. Ambivalence I see as normal. And I use the more sociological definition of ambivalence rather than the more psychiatric one. That is, the ambivalence is caused by the social situation, not by any of your mental health weakness. And I mentioned anger. I was just very, very angry at what I called the business of death and the paperwork that was demanded when all I wanted to do was grieve. So both grieving and being angry, both loving and hating, both resisting and doing. All of these ambivalences, I think, are normal given caregiving and that whole journey. Attachment changes, of course. Dr. Kleinman spoke a great deal about that. And so now the attachment is more through memory, through symbolism, through stories, lots of stories. By the way, stories are what need to be passed down. And then finally, new hope. That takes a while to figure out. We did a lot of theater together. He was a theater director and producer. So maybe I'll keep going to the theater and going to the concert halls and traveling. I haven't quite figured out my new hope yet. What I want to say to you is go through these 6 guideposts as you are a caregiver now and as your situation changes as you go on. And above all, of course, make peace with change. It just is happening all the time. Next slide. This is the book that I have written. It's done, it's gone to the press, but they take until November to bring it out. And in there, I have, in the last chapter, written about loss and change. And I want to share some of that with you. We have gradual losses, big and little. And I think we should mark each one and tell each other about it. When you see a new loss in your loved one, try to tell someone else about it. It shouldn't be boring. It's very painful. There's a grief at each one of those recognitions. It's like a stepwise going down. And at each time, some people actually have a little ritual when something new is lost in their loved one by lighting a candle. A woman in California told me she puts a paper bird out to sea each time she recognized some new loss. Do it your way. But the important thing is to share this with someone else so you're not bearing that new loss alone. So loss and change are inevitably linked. There's nothing we can do about it. And it's not wrong to think about what you want to do when your journey has shifted, as mine has. Some people feel guilty when they think about what to do after my loved one is gone. But I think it should be thought about ahead of time. Perhaps when you have a moment at night or a moment of respite, it's time to think about what to do with your life that will be life enhancing and that will make you happy and give you some joy. If you don't plan ahead of time, when the time comes, you may be bereft. You will be bereft, but you won't have any plans to pick up for the future. It might be time to talk about that with somebody. It is not wrong. And so may I end with this. As you all find some usefulness in these ideas about caregiving in the midst of pandemic's uncertainty, and you remember that the uncertainty comes from ambiguity, try to increase your tolerance for ambiguity. How do we do that? Well, there's a lot of research on it. There's even a tolerance for ambiguity scale. In sum, what it means is you increase your tolerance for doing new things, a change in routine, for embracing the unfamiliar, travel to a foreign country, sit and talk with a person you disagree with, try new ideas, try new things, embrace the unfamiliar, practice it. And I always say, go fishing. Many people who are fishermen and women don't know what they're going to get that day, but they seem to have a very good time. They face uncertainty with joy, and we can learn from them. Take a drive without a plan, have a meeting without an agenda. These are tests for increasing our ambiguity, our tolerance for ambiguity. We have been tested during this pandemic in an extraordinary and horrific way. The losses you already had as caregivers have been and are multiplied still today by an invisible enemy. Even your own health was threatened. May you find meaning and new hope in your own losses, whether they're clear or ambiguous, as you continue the immensely stressful work of giving care. Stay safe, but above all, take care of yourself, and thank you. Next slide. Back to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Dr. Boss, for your presentation. It was wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Kleinman, for sharing your deeply and professional perspectives with us today. So we received several questions. Some of them are from Dr. Boss, some are for Dr. Kleinman, and some I think both of you could answer. So I'd like to start with one that both of you I think could answer. The question is, and we'll start with Dr. Kleinman, sometimes I find myself wishing for the disease to quickly progress to get to the end sooner. It's so heartbreaking and devastating living each day, losing the one you love. How do you stay patient through the course of the disease, Dr. Kleinman?
Well, I think that's a wonderful question, and it shows that someone has really had a authentic existential experience, I think. We all have those moments when we feel that the burden is so great on the person we're caring for and on ourselves that it would be better if that person were no longer alive. We don't want to see them suffer. We don't want to see the pain they're in, and we recognize that it'll also free us. It's difficult to talk about these things with others because we often feel guilt at the same moment that we have that sense. I've seen many people in treatment over the years who had that kind of guilt associated with those feelings. They shouldn't be there because that is a normal experience. It's a normal feeling. And it is what makes complex. Let me put it this way. So Dr. Boss has given you some very good general ideas, I think. But I would say in 50 years of research and clinical experience, that every one of those ideas is complex and uncertain, and that they go in many different directions, and that it is our individuality and our social life and our cultural environment that makes every one of our stories separate. So the issue for you, I think, is to come to terms with that feeling of what is it that really is at stake when you say that you are feeling it would be better for the person if they weren't alive? Is it your sense deep inside that you just can't tolerate this anymore? Is it your sense that that person can't tolerate it? And then how does that fit into the kind of relationship that you had? There's no specific answer that can be given cookie cutter kind to everyone with this feeling. It's going to be in the context of your own particular life.
Dr. Boss. Thank you, Dr. Kleinman. Your thoughts?
I certainly agree with that. Everyone does it their own way. And I just gave 6 concepts on which to hook it, but you may find other ones as well. The main thing is that I think guilt will happen no matter what. And in cases where you say he's in so much pain, he would be better off gone, you probably at that moment will feel much more guilt than usual. But I think there's just, I've told my clients that just expect it is part of loss. There's always some guilt, and there's guilt in tragedy. You know, I've worked with somebody who felt guilty about a tornado coming. Well, underneath all of that is also the feeling that we can fix everything. So that sort of lies underneath it. No, we can't fix everything. We do a pretty good job, by the way, but there are some things that we just have to flow with the tide. And sometimes at the end of life, that's what it is.
Dr. Boss, I want to ask you, how do you make peace with change? I mean, obviously, you've just shared with us that you're experiencing tremendous change.
Yes.
What's a good starting point, in your opinion?
Well, I like to use both and thinking. I didn't talk about it today, but it's not the dialectic because there's no synthesis. But I always now try. Remember, I'm a very mastery-oriented person and I'm trying to get over it. I also dislike ambiguity and I've spent 40 years studying it. So what I'm trying to do is to say, I've lost the love of my life, and I both lost the love of my life, and I can move forward with something new. Don't know what that is yet, except I do know it's family and children and grandchildren. I do know it's that. And boy, that's really a mainstay for me. But there are a lot of unanswered questions. And I think you can say, again, using both and thinking, I'm really certain about this, and I'm also uncertain about that. And that way of thinking has been very useful for people I've worked with, also for myself, when you don't have a clear answer yet. And you might never have, by the way.
And our viewers can actually find more information about both and thinking in it. You talk about it in the book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, correct?
I do. Yes, I do. And for professionals, it would be in the book called Loss and Trauma, W.W. Norton, a 2006 book for professionals.
Thank you, Dr. Boss. Dr. Kleinman, what are some strategies for acquiring help when there is no family members to help you? You had talked about hiring paid caregivers to come into the home, especially if there are no friends or the friends are limited and unable to help due to their own medical issues, no long-term health insurance, which we know is a huge issue in this country, and money is scarce, fixed incomes, etc. What are your thoughts?
Well, it sounds like you're asking about the rationale for Duet. It seems to me that this is the rationale for wonderful organizations, of which Duet is, I'm sure, one example. There are many of them across the country. This is the nature of American voluntarism and our desire to help others who we know are in distress. I think you look for that kinds of thing. You look for a very helpful kind of person as a social worker who's knowledgeable about the healthcare system, who's knowledgeable about resources that you can have. You can usually find a social worker through the healthcare practice that you go to, whether it's a primary care practice with specialists. But also, this is exactly what you should expect your doctor to help you with, and why medicine is in such a crisis today, because doctors forget about the aftercare once they've made the diagnosis and use the few treatments that are available. So I would say all those things. Anything that works, Freud once said, anything that works is good. I would say the same thing. Anything that works is good.
Well, how would you address the issue of cohesion? Because I think that's one of the challenges. Not everyone is connecting the dots within the system, correct? So your doctor isn't maybe familiar with an organization like Duet or the Banner Alzheimer's Institute, those types of things. So how can people be better connected?
Yeah, remember Ian Foster at the end of one of his novels said, only connect. Connections are the key. It's the bread and butter of social life, are our connections. But Americans seem to be extremely lonely at this time. We're reading about loneliness as an epidemic during COVID. And that means also that they're having trouble with connections. So being able to come out of yourself and go into the world. I took that to be the wisdom of the last things that Dr. Boss was saying. And I strongly agree with that. This is the Chinese view of the world, but I've worked in China for most of my life. It's had an enormous impact on me. The Chinese perspective is that Americans are simplistic in thinking that you go inside yourself and you find your true self, and then you simply unfold the true self. Rather, you go into your relationships, you go into the world, and then that helps you within yourself to create who you are.
Yeah.
We create who we are. We create it through stories, we create it through experiences, and we create it through our engagements with others. And I thought that was the great wisdom at the end of, I myself will be interested in reading Dr. Boss's new book, because I think that that is exactly right. From everything in my experience, personal experience and clinical and research experience shows me that that's right. That you want to get out, you got to get out into the world again. People forget that when we look at the research on bereavement, it's only in the last 15 years that we realize that yearning is an important part of bereavement. Before that, if you looked at definitions of bereavement, it was always about sadness and loss and the like. But yearning is just as important as the sadness and loss. And that yearning is not just, it is primarily for the person who's gone, but it's not just for the person who's gone. Symbolically, it's for getting out into the world again, being connected with others, because life is with others.
Dr. Boss, do you have any thoughts on that idea of yearning? That's an interesting point, Dr. Kleinman. Thank you.
A lot of the people tell me they're yearning for closure, which is also related to that, because that means they can forget about that part of their life and go forward to a new life. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's the both and again. You will have both the past life and a new life ahead of you. And if you look at it in a more both and lens rather than the absolute either or lens, it's easier to go forward. You're more quickly out there in social life again. If you don't have to close the door on the person you lost, if you have to close the door on the person you lost, many of us would resist. My first great loss was when I was 19. My little brother, whom I had taken care of because we were on a farm and my mother had to help in the fields. So I was a junior mother to him. He went to Boy Scout camp at age 13, and after he came home, he got polio. And within a week, he died. It was bulbar polio, a year before the Salk vaccine came out. At that time, I thought I'd never be happy again. And you know what? I have been happy again. His picture is here. I don't forget him. And all the other people, I'm 86, so all the other people that I can list who I've lost. The older you get, the more losses you have. But what you do is you remember and move forward. And by the way, I found that people don't like it when I use the term move on, but they don't mind if I use the term move forward. I have learned that from the people I've worked with. For some reason, move forward is more uplifting, and moving on means you're leaving the lost person behind, and they don't want to do that. So yearning, yes, the yearning should be more in the literature. I agree with that. But yearning for closure is not the right yearning. We should yearn for how to live with loss, and we can do that. It's very possible to do that as long as you don't close the door on it.
I think this question is perhaps for both of you. After years of research, what did you learn once you became a caregiver yourself, Dr. Kleinman?
Well, that's what The Soul of Care is about, the book I wrote. You can read earlier books of mine, The Illness Narratives, What Really Matters. I've done more than 40 books, but I really learned about caregiving by doing it. And I think that it's everything I said. It's the doing that makes you a caregiver. It's not the talking. We're talking about it now. This is not the caregiving. You know it from your own experiences. It's your putting on of hands. It's your holding up. It's your cleaning someone. It's your helping them toilet. It's your helping them eat, ambulating with them. That's what caregiving is. It's the work of care. It's literally work, and it's visceral, physical, as well as emotional and spiritual work. And I think that's what you learn from being a family carer. We're talking about what happens when you can sit back and begin to think about what you're going through. While you're doing this, at least in my experience, I wasn't thinking about anything. You just do it. It's there to do, you do it. I remember I once wrote the preface to a book by E.S. Goldman, which he wrote under a pseudonym, Aaron Altera. He was a great writer, E.S. Goldman, for the New Yorker. His book was called The Caregiver, and it had to do with caring for his wife who died of Alzheimer's disease. We were in a bookstore where he was giving a talk, and I just went to be there. I had written a preface to the book. And he was 93, holding a walker, talking about the book, which had just come out in its second edition. And a young woman said to him, "Well, God, it sounds so difficult and everything. Why did you do it? Why do you do this?" And he looked at her incredulous and said, "I don't quite understand. What are you asking me?" She said, "Well, why would you do this? Why would you do this care?" And he said, "It was there to do. It was part of the vows, you know. It was the way we lived our lives together. I just did it." Yeah.
Dr. Boss, your thoughts?
Well, the first thing I learned was humility. My goodness, what I didn't know. And it just, it's easier to write a book about caregiving than it is to do it. I can tell you that. And so I would write a different book now than the one I wrote, though for some reason, I actually went back and read the one I wrote because it was helpful to me when I was struggling. So yes, humility, I think, it knocks you down. It knocked me down. And then I got up again and realized that was a good thing. We all need to be more humble in order to be empathic. And empathy is what it takes for caregiving. There's no reward in it. You do it, as he said, because it's there to do. And also the vows, they matter. You said in sickness and in health. And you really want to honor those vows. You love that person, even though they're not the person you knew before. So I would just say, well, it knocked me down a few pegs. Yes, it did. And I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. Another question for Dr. Kleinman and potentially Dr. Boss as well, if you want to chime in. My biggest fear or stress, that I will make the wrong decision about my husband's health. When to take him to the hospital, when not to. I feel like his life is in my hands. How do I cope? It's a very intense question, I think.
I think that's a great question. And let me tell you, and it's going to happen to you. There's a very interesting book you might look at, put out by the National Academy of Medicine. It's kind of a meta study of studies of family-based care. It came out about 5 years ago. It's called Families Caring for an Aging America. And it shows you, for example, that so chaotic is our healthcare system today that the average elderly patient coming out of a surgical procedure goes home and has 2 tubes coming out of their abdomen to drain maybe fluid from the abdomen and fluid from the gallbladder, whatever. No one has told either the patient, or they may have told the patient has been so sedated that they didn't understand, but no one has told the family. That's the typical thing. And the misreading of HIPAA rules leads doctors and nurses to be very limited in what they tell a family, which is not what HIPAA rules are meant to be about, by the way. So you're home, you got these 2 tubes coming out, no one's told you. How do you take care of this? Will you infect them? Will you create a problem that could kill your loved one? This is commonplace today. And what you've got to do is you've got to speak back to the system. You've got to demand answers. You've got to ask a nurse. You've got to ask a doctor. And when you do, when you put them on the spot, generally you'll get some response. Okay? It's the chaos of the system, the uncertainty of the moment, the tremendous pressures on healthcare professionals that leave them inattentive. They lose their clinical imagination, which should lead them to think about what is going to be needed at home. So you've got to bring that forward. I think that's one of the most important things that a family member can do. I visited with my late wife, Joan, a clinic, a great neurology clinic at Harvard. And you have to realize I've been a professor at Harvard Medical School for over 4 decades. Everyone there wanted to help me, do everything they could to help me. And yet I realized that so frightened were they by opening up what they called Pandora's box, that all these emotions, all these questions will flood them, that doctors and nurses try to get you through these appointments as quickly as they possibly can. Don't accept it, okay? I'm telling you this, don't accept it. And what you do is you ask questions and you wait to get those answers. And you keep asking questions until you get the answers. My experience is that most clinical personnel are well-intended. They didn't realize that no one explained to you. They didn't understand that you need to have this information. You demand it and you'll get it. And that's what one of the key roles for a family caregiver, because the person you're with often has some cognitive disturbance or has some other problem that makes it difficult for them to ask the questions. You've got to be there to support them and ask the questions. One last point I want to make. One of the problems medicine has, it's a really deep problem, is it fails to recognize the team, that you and your family member who is ill are actually a caring team. And so given all the emphasis today on individual responsibilities and the like, they'll often talk only to the person who has the problem or only to the family carer. No good. Either way is no good. They've got to talk to both of you. You have to represent yourself as a family carer, but also make sure that your loved one is there as well, is seen as a person. They may not be the same person they were at the start of this, but they are a person. They are a human being. They must be responded to, okay? I think your question is a great one, and I think the answer is so much in your active life. You can do this.
I wonder, Dr. Boss, if you can sort of pick up on that, because I know in my own experience, and we've all had this experience where you assume that the medical expert is the expert and you may not push. How did you push, Dr. Boss? Did you have to find your voice, or were you very assertive, or what advice would you give to a caregiver who may struggle to find that voice that Dr. Kleinman talked about, to be assertive, to speak up, to push back on the establishment, the medical establishment, when you know something doesn't sit well with you, or you're unclear?
I would say I did push, certainly we had many different specialists. I want to say this though, and this may be a Midwestern answer, so forgive me if it is. We have a lot of family practice doctors here, and they are the primary doctor. And I found that doctor will sit and talk to both the patient and the caregiver. My daughter is one of those doctors, and that is what they feel their job is. And frequently, to get around HIPAA, she insists that the older person bring in an adult child, daughter or son, and she calls family meetings and so on. Specialists, by the way, can't do this. I understand that. They are specialists because they know a special thing about a certain disease. They are not as family oriented, nor should they have to be. So a primary physician, an internist, a family practice physician would probably be more easy to go to once you've gotten the diagnosis or whatever it is you need a specialist for. And there you can literally have family meetings. Sometimes the siblings who are far away are on the phone, but my daughter, for example, will tell patients that, let me tell your family that he can't drive anymore. That way he's angry at me and not you. Those are the kinds of systemic helps that a physician at a lower level can do. We shouldn't expect all of that from a specialist, though we need the specialists too.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
I agree with one half, and I strongly disagree with the other half. And I'm saying this as a physician and a professor at a leading medical school. Okay, absolutely. If you have a good primary care doc, family doc, or a primary care internist, they're going to play a central role with you here. They're going to be with you. Okay, but there is one profession of medicine that does such a lousy job in care that you must be active in making demands of it, and that's neurology. Just think of who neurologists take care of. They take care of stroke patients. They take care of patients with all the neurodegenerative diseases, okay? All the dementias, and they do not give care afterward. Why? Because they don't see that as part of their task. But that's nonsense, because they're the ones who are seeing the patients with Alzheimer's, the patients with ALS, the patients with stroke. They've got to be aware, and you've got to make them aware of the importance of the aftercare. And when you do that, they will respond. They do respond. It's that they are frightened, literally frightened, of getting too involved. But if you raise the good question with them, if you don't have a primary care doctor you can speak with, for example, or a nurse practitioner who you can speak with, if you don't have someone who's helping you in this setting, you've got to make a demand on the neurologist. And I can tell you that is a field that's undergoing change. In the future, you're going to see neurologists much more involved with what for them is their bread and butter. That is the aftercare of the patients. You look at the field of neurology, they have all the diagnosis, they have very few drugs, effective drugs, very few right now. All of their practice is about people like you and me doing the family caring for chronic dementias or neurodegenerative diseases. They've got to be responsible as well. And so that's where I say, you be active, make the demands, and you'll see, most of the time, you will see a response. That's my experience.
I want to move on. Dr. Boss, do you want to respond?
Yes, I want to say I certainly had my time with neurologists. I can tell you that. But the way the University of Minnesota clinics were set up is the neurologist will give you the information about the neurology exam, but then it is passed to the primary physician, who's a more systemic thinker and gets all the information from all the specialists, and then can talk to you about how to go ahead. So I would say this, there are many caregivers out there who don't have any specialists at their beck and call. They don't live near big cities. And so we're stuck with the primary care physician for whom I have great respect. And sometimes the big city physicians will actually not be there because the information comes to the smaller cities by the internet from the tests that were taken. So I think it's a both and again. You need to stick up for your rights. You need to look the doctor in the face and say, you need to talk to me because he doesn't remember. And you need to know the personality of your doctor and the time they are given, allotted, and what their specialty is. And so, you know, there's no one right way. It depends on where you live in the United States or the world. There may be no specialists around.
I want to combine a couple of questions that I think have a similar thread. And the first one is actually for Dr. Boss, and then perhaps Dr. Kleinman, you might have some thoughts. So the question is regarding a viewer's elderly mother and her increased use of alcohol since COVID restrictions have limited activities at her senior living community. With moderate dementia, she's demonstrably affected by alcohol and seems to have forgotten that she's already had a drink, and it's become a daily argument. Another individual also asked, what can a caregiver do when their loved one becomes combative? So it seems like the argument, the combativeness is perhaps heightened during COVID. So Dr. Boss, we'll start with you and get your thoughts.
Well, I do believe that the caregiver should be safe. And sometimes caregivers are over empathic, so much so that they forget about their own safety. If safety is an issue, then you need to think about alternative care, or better, if you can afford it, or if it's available, have another caregiver come in who's not part of the family. And frequently family members will settle down for a stranger caregiver. A home health aide is what I'm talking about, as opposed to a family member. It also may mean that you're exhausted and they sense it, and that, I would take a couple days off a week, have another person come in, and they might settle down from that. But you also mentioned alcohol. It seems to me that that could be a problem. I didn't know if this person was in a care facility or at home.
They are in a community, though I'm not sure if it's independent or otherwise. But she said a senior living community. So my guess is perhaps independent, so she can have whatever she wants in her apartment or assisted.
Yes, and does she have dementia?
She does have, she had said with moderate dementia. It seems as though with the moderate dementia, she's forgetting that she already had a drink. And then the daughter or the caregiver, yes, the daughter is arguing with the mother, you already had a drink. The mother says, no, I didn't. So you're kind of it seems like she's running into these tension.
Overall, I've seen a lot of caregivers, and especially if it's parent-child, if it's the child taking care of a parent, they have to change their identity, how they see themselves, because she probably did what her mother told her all her life. And it's going to reverse now. She has to be in charge. The person with impaired cognition can't be in charge. Of course, they should have some choice. But in this case, it would be quite easy, I would think, to dilute the drink, to not to substitute it with something else, to just say, you already had this drink, you can only have one a day, or something like that. In other words, she needs to reverse roles. And that's a tough one, because when you reverse roles, it means you've lost your parent. As a parent, you're now parenting your parent.
Do you have any tips on how to do that? Because that is very hard, and it's not normal.
It's not normal, but it's dangerous not to do it. I've seen adult children say mother still wants to cook, and she's lit the fire several times, or someone wants to drive. No, the person who's got a rational mind needs to make the decisions. And again, if you don't want to make the decision, go to your primary doctor with this person. Tell the primary doctor ahead of time. They can listen. They might not call you back. And they can say, I recommend this. Many of your primary doctors are willing to play the bad person and ease it on the family member. Dr. Kleinman said something about a team. Absolutely, it has to be a team. And so this younger caregiver, the daughter or son, need to now be in charge.
Dr. Kleinman, do you have any thoughts on dealing with challenging loved ones or that dynamic?
Since that's very good psychological advice, let me just bring in some psychiatric side of this. for neurodegenerative diseases, you often see a number of psychiatric syndromes develop. One is paranoid delusions. Another is Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome occurred to my late wife. And that's the delusion that the person who's caring for you is not real, and that your house is not real, and everything is an imposter. And with those kinds of syndromes, with paranoid syndromes, and you get a lot of help from a geriatric psychiatrist. By and large, primary care doctors don't use psychiatric drugs very effectively, except for antidepressants. For delusions, you really need a geriatric psychiatrist. My wife developed Capgras syndrome. I prescribed a variety of things I thought would help, and did many of the supportive things that I had learned in psychotherapy as a professional. I found none of them worked. And the geriatric psychiatrist was able to straighten things out with the right medication. So you're listening to us talking about personal support and psychological interventions. Don't forget that some mental health interventions have got to be medications.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
I want to jump into, I'm getting a few questions about sort of guilt. So I'll start with this question. I know we kind of touched on it with one of the earlier questions about wanting it to be over, which I feel like is not, that's a normal feeling. This person asked, when my unresponsive husband with dementia and other medical issues was taken to the ER, and as I walked out of the house to follow the ambulance to the hospital, I thought, now I'll have more room in my closet. That shocked me. Was my brain revealing the real me? And somebody else asked about can you provide insight in how to deal with the guilt when moving a spouse into a long-term care facility? So I feel like we're getting a lot of questions about just the enormity of the guilt that these caregivers are experiencing, the wanting it. I think Dr. Boss, you talked about this at one point, wanting it to be over, but if it's over, that means the person is passed. Can you, Dr. Boss, let's start with you, some real solid advice on how to cope with this guilt, these feelings of like, I wish they would pass away, or I'll have more room in my closet, or I have to place them, I'm feeling tremendous guilt, and I feel shame and I feel bad.
Well, that's the sociological ambivalence I was talking about. And yes, it ends up in causing a great deal of guilt. I try to normalize that. The context is such, full of ambiguity, full of uncertainty, that it leads to a different way of thinking, and it unstabilizes people to be living in that kind of situation. So you're going to, I think what I would do if I thought I'll have more room in my closet, try to just smile and say, well, there it is, there's the ambivalence. It's normalize it. It's a normal thing in an abnormal situation, okay? And so we do have things like this. I wish it were over is one of the most common things that caregivers feel. And then the second after that, you feel guilty. But I would say you're human. And so it's okay. Now, when it's not okay is if frequently, if you don't talk about it, it can fester in a way that if you're alone and there are no other people in your circle helping you, it can lead to some neglect, caregiver neglect, or caregiver violence. And then that's what you want to prevent. So I encourage you, when you do something like that, tell somebody else about it. If it's serious, of course, you need to get some professional help. If it's immobilizing you, if it's leading to a neglect, if it's leading to abuse of the patient, you need professional help.
I wonder if both of you can.
Can I just respond a little
Sure,
further? I had the deep and really the kind of personal breaking experience of my wife going into a nursing home about 6 months before she died. The reason for that was not only was she agitated all the time, even with medications at that stage. But she was becoming increasingly paralyzed, and I couldn't lift her any longer out of a bath or into a wheelchair. I found that the most difficult thing in my life, the single most difficult thing in my life. And I felt, just like that question was put, I felt a sense of failure, total failure. I remember calling my adult children after, and when my wife went into nursing home, and just breaking down in tears, something I don't regularly do. Feeling totally a failure, with enormous guilt, because I had promised her on the very day she got the diagnosis that I would take care of her for the rest of her life, every day, until the end. In fact, more than that, she had asked me, and she said, I did not want to linger. I don't want to linger. You or our primary care doc will help me die at some point, because I'm not going to linger. I'm not going to continue in a way that diminishes me completely. Of course, we couldn't do that. But putting her into the nursing home was unbelievably difficult. And she was in a great cognitive care unit at a fantastic place called Newbridge on Charles in Massachusetts. And it took me a while, and slowly I realized that the real problem I had was I had come too late in her care, the nursing home. I should have thought earlier about, for the two of us, assisted living for a period of time, or earlier than I had. In fact, one of the cognitive care nurses said to me, you know, in many ways, you've come too late. You took care of her so late into this. You should have come much earlier for yourself. And I just felt that that was not appropriate. I made that decision. I felt totally guilty. And I don't think there is a way of getting over that feeling, frankly. I think you got to live with it. You got to recognize that there are certain things in our life that are existentially part of the human experience. And failure is one of them, and you have to admit it. Right. I admitted to myself that I failed. I didn't do what I wanted. I couldn't do what I wanted to do, and I was going to have to live with a sense of guilt. And I have. My wife died 10 years ago. I felt that same feeling almost every day when I think about it.
We only have a few more minutes left, so thank you, Dr. Kleinman. And I feel that as well, and I can empathize with what you just said. I'd love to get some kind of like rapid response, practical advice. This question, nurses are on the front line most of the time in the acute care setting, as well as in the community and home health. They're the 24-hour professional caregivers. Haven't heard how they can be of most help. So if each of you had maybe two things that you would give the professionals who do the caregiving, either in facilities or home health, what should they leave this symposium with? Two things. Dr. Boss, I'll start with you. Two pieces of advice.
First of all, they too should pay attention to the at-home caregiver and not just ignore that person because they're part of the team. I was fortunate to have that. And other than that, I would say they're angels, absolute angels. I could not have done it without their help. And they taught me many things, wound care and other things that I didn't know how to do. We were a team, and I felt fortunate for that. I'm very grateful.
Dr. Kleinman.
I would just say, you know, this sense of being in it together. I think that nurse who's part of that hospice team says to you, I'm going to be with you throughout this. Yeah. I'm with you. I'm there with you. I think that's critical.
And then again, sort of same piece of advice. What wisdom or advice would you give students currently preparing to enter the medical field and become effective and sufficient caregivers in the era of COVID? What should they know? How should they go into this field with a different attitude than, say, other doctors who are older and have been doing this for 30 years.
Well, Dr. Kleinman probably knows more about this than I, but I would just say this quickly, that, you know, if you join the Army, you're taking a risk. I have a granddaughter who's a firefighter. She's taking a risk. And I think the medical students who enter now need to know they're taking a risk too. But bless them all, we need them. So I hope some will take the risk.
Well, I think we're going to have more people going into medicine and public health now than we would have earlier because of COVID. But let me say that before COVID, 50% of doctors in the United States had the symptoms of burnout. 50% of physicians in the United States had the symptoms of burnout before COVID. I bet you that number is going up in this period of time. But the key that I learned, and I teach medical students, is your suffering matters. It matters a lot. But when you're with a patient, it's the patient's suffering who matters most.
That's right.
And I think keeping that balance, which I like Dr. Boss's idea of and putting both together rather than separating them. Yes, your suffering really does count, but you're there to care for that patient. And the moral, that is a more, we don't like to use the term moral, but that is a moral bond. It's a commitment. Sometimes it's a spiritual commitment. It's a commitment that goes beyond simply a business relationship. This is a moral commitment. I'm there to help you, to be with you. And I think we've seen marvelous examples of this in COVID from doctors and nurses all over the country. And I just hope that that will continue in the post-COVID era.
We have several more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time, and I wish we could have another few hours to answer all of them because they're wonderful questions. And I think so many caregivers are just struggling and just need support and help. But on that note, I just want to thank Dr. Kleinman and Dr. Boss for taking the time to join us today to answer these important questions. I encourage everyone to keep asking, to keep fighting, to be the voice for your loved one. Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to also thank our gold sponsor, AARP Phoenix or Arizona, and our copper sponsors, Dignity Health, Hospice of the Valley, and KJZZ. I'd also like to thank once again our wonderful speakers, Dr. Boss and Dr. Kleinman, for joining us, and for all of you who are in attendance and your important questions. Keep asking the questions, keep fighting the fight. I hope you found today's discussion as beneficial as I did, and I can put some of what you learned today, hopefully you can put some of what you learned today into practice. I know, again, we didn't get to all of the questions, but hopefully you were able to extract some nuggets of information. I know I did. One of something Dr. Boss said, grief is not linear. That stuck with me. So that will be one of my nuggets from this symposium. I'm also pleased to announce that we had a drawing for autographed books from both Dr. Kleinman and Dr. Boss. I'd like to start with the winners for Dr. Kleinman's book. So The Soul of Care, The Moral Education of a Husband and a Doctor. So the 5 winners are Steve Aragon, Shelley Bagel, Marilise Castang, Megan Cox, and Vivian Evans. And then for Dr. Boss's book, which will be coming out in November, The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in a Time of Pandemic, Gloria Jenkins, Elizabeth Warner, Karen Olson, Deborah Sazdoff, and Stanley Wright. So Duet staff will be mailing the winners their books, but please note Dr. Boss's book won't be coming out until November. So please be patient with that. And before we leave, we would love it if you could complete the survey that's included in the chat link. It's a Survey Monkey. And so please take a few moments to fill that out before you log off. And with that, thank you for joining us on this virtual family symposium. We could not have done it without the incredible volunteers, staff, of course, our speakers, Dr. Kleinman and Dr. Boss, and all of you who've taken the time to join us today. So thank you very much. And please reach out for help and take care of yourself. It's the best thing you can do. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.